that translate into terms that fall in these four buckets?
Yeah.
And those are the terms that you will be able to communicate with any leader in the organization.
Mm.
Right. So, for example, a team working over the weekend will incur some cost of overtime because you'll have to pay people for working over the weekend. In
Agree.
your case, it was a comp off, but it is still payment in some way.
Yes.
Right. But the other thing is also that the team's morale is down, and so that will lead to some level of attrition as well.
Agree.
Right. And there's cost associated with attrition, and we'll look at how to calculate that. In terms of error prone deployments, that leads to loss of reputation. It leads to loss of revenue, which is, both of them are on the protect revenue side. So you're sort of losing revenue, and you need to protect it. Um, and in some situations it also incurs penalties. So I remember in India, I think HDFC and ICICI have both faced penalties because their site used to keep going down, and I think there was a period of time where HDFC couldn't take on any more credit card customers, for example. And
Yeah.
that's a huge penalty to pay for error prone deployments or for the site going down again and again. And that is something that anyone in the organization will pay attention to.
Yes.
Right. Longer feature cycle time can be seen as an opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is nothing but uh, you are doing activity A
Mm.
instead of doing activity B, which is more profitable.
Yeah.
So instead of developing new features, which is more profitable activity, you are spending that time doing this cumbersome 48-hour deployment. And so you're spending your capacity where you're not making money out of it. Right. And
Yeah.
so if you were able to spend that capacity to actually build new features, then you would likely be able to increase your revenue. So
Actually.
these are the so what terms that you need to come up with whenever you have this kind of a situation. I think people are very comfortable till this second column, till the results column, but converting that into a monetary value of so what is very important. But it doesn't stop here. The other thing that you also need to do is to now actually calculate each of these costs.
Yes.
Right. So what is the cost of overtime? How much overtime are we actually paying?
Mm.
What is the cost of hiring and onboarding new people? Because when attrition happens, you are basically, there's going to be a churn in your team. So let's say X number of employees left and you
Mm.
hired someone else instead of them. There'll be some cost of hiring and onboarding those people, and that
Mm.
is what you need to calculate. Or similarly, for loss of reputation, loss of revenue, I mean, these terms can be easily understood by non-tech leaders as well,
True.
but they still will not be able to make a decision on whether this problem is worth solving or not until you put a dollar value to the actual items here. Right. So what we need to do next is to actually do the calculation to figure out how big is this problem. Do we even need to solve it? Let's say that the loss of reputation was a $20 problem. I'm just
Mm.
making it up. But if it was something minuscule like a $20 problem, then you wouldn't worry about it. You will say, okay, fine, let me lose some reputation, I don't care about it.
Yeah.
But if it's a 2 million problem, then you will definitely solve it. And
Yes.
so you need to be able to convert it into actual dollar figures. So
Yeah.
let's see
Yeah.
how we can do that. But you were saying something, Chance.
Yeah, actually, for us, until the situation and the result, I think that was seen by everybody.
Hmm.
And for us as engineering leaders, like the so what, some of them were like very intuitive. At least in like the attrition 1B used to come up as a recurring retrospective topic, and there was this undertone that people were unhappy because it not only affected their technical aspirations but their work-life balance as well, and
Right.
also a sense of disconnect from the leaders because we were unable to do something about it. And then even penalties to see in a way I feel personally is connected to a because I'm a HDFC customer from a long time, and the
Hmm.
situation that you described happened, but I was an existing customer because
Hmm.
because my bank was in shown in negative light, the trust was eroded very quickly, and
Right.
for the brand to earn the trust back it takes time. So I did consider options at that time.
Hmm.
So in a way some are interlinked, but Now I think back on my earlier days as a tech lead, it feels like I should have done something to zoom out a bit to so that the so what things emerges like very clearly, and like you're shown in red, like the what's that worth was quite ambiguous, and I think at that time I did not have the tools to connect it to this, and now I can think back even as I described the framework earlier. It's very easy to connect those red sort of things that we show here back to what it means in terms of value. Like we said, how do you quantify it, and then how do you link it back to the business strategy as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a real problem because as we'll see in the calculations, you have to
Yeah,
make a bunch of assumptions to be able to move ahead with these calculations, and some of those are tricky assumptions, and you don't want to really do it. It's certainly most people feel like, okay, as a tech lead, that's not my job. I don't want to worry about that. I want to worry about architecture and technology and code and all of that stuff.
yeah,
But if you don't worry about it, no one else is going to be able to articulate it in as well as you will be able to. And
agree.
so it is very important for you to gain this new tool and to use it effectively to get the right investments for your projects. So should we look at one of the calculations? Let's look at
Yes,
overtime, which is a pretty simple calculation. um, what we are saying here is that 48-hour deployment leads to the team working over the weekend, and so
yeah,
there is some amount of overtime that we have to pay for the team,
agree.
right? And so we are doing a very simple calculation here. We have taken some facts. Facts are things that you're sure about. So number of working days in a year is
Mm,
a you is a known fact. You don't need to guess. Number of people working on the weekend. I've assumed that there are 6 people working on the weekend,
correct.
and then number of deployments per year is 12 deployments because it's one per month,
Hmm.
right? Now the to calculate overtime, one of the assumptions that you'll have to make is how much annual salary on an average does a team member get.
Mm,
Right now, this you might not know this figure, so that's why it's under assumptions, but you will have to assume some amount. And so as a tech lead, if you've stayed with the organization long enough, you've seen how your salary has progressed.
yes.
Or you might get some numbers from broad annual reports and those kind of sources. So you'll
Mm,
have to make some assumptions or get this data from somewhere and assume an average salary. So let's say that the average salary is $50,000 for this particular team. Now, if you do that, then what we're going to do is try to calculate the salary per person per day, right? So if a person earns $50,000 in a year and there are
yeah.
220 working days, then it means that you're earning about $227 per day,
Yes.
right? And then so you're working 2 extra days over the weekend. So
Mm,
per person, the overtime cost is $454.
yeah.
And what that means is that for 6 people, the cost is coming to 2,724.
Mm,
And what is very important and good to do is to annualize all of these costs so that you have one basis.
okay.
So when you talk about any kind of cost, you should talk about how much is this going to cost me for 1 year or for
Mm,
some unit of time, but typically 1 year, right? And so you'll say that, okay, it costs me 2724 every weekend or every time I do a 48-hour deployment. And so for 12 such deployments over the year, it'll cost me about $32,000,
yeah.
right? And that is when you see what is the magnitude of overtime that you're paying.
Yeah.
One nice trick is to express these values in terms of something that feels very tangible.
Mm,
So this is as good as having an extra person for 65% of their capacity, and that makes it very stark for people to pay attention to and say, okay, I understand that this is a big enough problem to solve now.
that's powerful, Akshay. It almost makes me gravitate to the solution as a tech lead to say that, yeah, this new person could have worked on the solution to actually make this problem go away.
Correct, right? And yeah, so it'll pay for itself
Yeah.
if you get a new person to work on this.
And you're saying if you solve the problem, actually, you're saying that annual cost is $32,688. But if you invest X amount of money, that becomes a recurring sort of benefit, right? You will like you'll not
Yes,
incur it again ever.
correct.
Correct?
You will, yeah, you're right, that you will actually gain that benefit
Mm.
multiple times over multiple years,
Okay. Mm.
right? So this is a simple calculation. It's about overtime. Let's look at a little more complicated calculation. We won't go through all the details,
Okay.
but you are going to use a very similar way of thinking
Mm.
to calculate attrition as well.
Okay.
So here, to understand the cost of attrition, we have to understand the cost of hiring and onboarding new people,
Right.
right? And so we are making a bunch of now assumptions, and we are gathering a bunch of facts here. So the team size is 10, the average salary, let's say, is 50,000. It takes 10 days for people to get onboarded.
Mm.
uh, then the average cost of hiring is 6,000. So to hire someone whose annual salary is 50,000, you would likely pay about 6,000 in terms of cost of interview, cost of an agency if you're sourcing from somewhere, those kind of things. These
Right.
should be available with your recruitment team if you want to do this calculation for yourself.
Yeah.
And similarly, number of working days in a year is 220. And then we have made a bunch of assumptions here about how much mentor bandwidth is used every time someone new joins.
Mm.
So let's say that a mentor has to spend 10% of their time for
Mm.
every new joinee. Similarly, there's a productivity loss of the new joinee in during their period of onboarding. So for the first
Agree.
10 days, they will be working, let's say, only at 30% productivity. So
Mm.
70% is the loss of productivity there. And then you have to make a guess about how much attrition can you attribute to this problem,
Mm.
right? So let's say that because of this problem, we are attributing about 10% attrition.
Mm.
And there might be other reasons for other attrition that is happening. So let's say that salary is not being enough is also a component of attrition, but
Mm.
we're discounting that here. So we're saying that 10% attrition happens because of this problem that we have. And then there is something called value factor. Now
Mm.
value factor is a tricky assumption, but the basic idea is that the business can be profitable if the employee is producing more value than the salary that they're getting,
Mm.
right? And so value factor is basically a ratio of how much value do they produce versus how much salary do they get.
Yeah.
So let's say that the employee is getting $50,000 every year.
Mm.
If they are able to produce $100,000 during that year,
Yeah.
then for the business, then it means that their value factor is 2, because they
Mm.
are producing twice as much money as they are getting as salary.
Mm.
So that's what value factor is. And you can do this. There are some industry standard ratios like revenue per employee.
Mm.
So if you use those kind of standard ratios, they again, if you have a public limited company, these are all things that will probably be there in your annual report,
Yeah.
or at least the raw material for all of this will be available in the annual report. And then you can very easily calculate these factors, so you don't need to make assumptions. But here, because we don't have any annual report or anything like that, we're just making a assumption of the value factor that
Mm.
every employee produces 2.5 times their salary is worth
Mm.
in in revenue.
Fair.
And so if you make those assumptions and do these calculations, you feel free to take a screenshot of this and then check out the calculations. But what we are essentially saying is that for a year you are incurring $9,634 as your cost of attrition. And so what you will need to do is you will need to calculate the cost for each of these headings,
Yeah.
right? So we calculated overtime, we calculated attrition.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, let's make some assumptions about the others. So
Yeah.
loss of reputation and loss of revenue both equate to customer churn.
Correct.
And so let's say that the value of customer churn is 200,000.
Mm.
The value of penalties is 100,000, and then there is
Mm.
some 57,000 worth of opportunity cost
Mm.
that we are incurring because of this problem. So all in all, what we are understanding from all of this calculation is that the size of this problem is $400,000.
Yeah. It's big.
Yeah, and so what that means is that there's about $500,000 on the table. And so if you
Yeah.
make the right investments, you will either be able to save this money or you'll be able to make this money. And this is something that will easily get someone's attention. So this is now the problem side of the situation. So we know that the problem is worth solving because
Yeah.
it's about $500,000 at stake. But now we need to talk about the solution.